Hello and welcome to the Legal Edition. I'm your host, attorney Mary Kay Loyan. Our show topic today, crisis at the border, migrants, motherhood, and medical care. Our guest is Denice Labertew. She is a women's rights advocate and professor. She provides policy guidance on the treatment of women and girls around the globe. She has provided guidance on the Violence Against Women Act and the UN Human Rights Council. Let's welcome Professor Denice Labertew. Welcome, Professor Labertew.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to be here, Mary Kay. Excited.
Now, your work is, you've worked on issues with regards to migrant women coming across the border. Why don't you fill us in? You've done so much with regards to working with foreign states in India, working on Violence Against Women Act. Please fill us in on what is currently going on at the border and your work.
Yeah, great. I'm so excited that we get to talk about this. And one of the reasons I'm really excited for us to talk about this is because I think that we've had a lot of focus on the border without a lot of focus on the experiences of women and girls at the border. And so, one of the things that is important for us to consider is that at least half of those who pass through the US-Mexico border are going to be women and girls. Many of those are fleeing violence in their own countries, also have experienced violence along the route into the US, the migration route, are experiencing significant economic hardships, climate change. Climate change is a real push factor in terms of migration. And so without an emphasis really on women and girls at the border, we're really missing a huge component of the human rights abuses that are happening. And so the work specifically around this issue is to really elevate those experiences of migrant women and girls who are in migration detention. The Trump administration's zero tolerance policy have created a disproportionate number of migrants that are in U.S. immigration detention and increase those numbers of women as well. So really raising these issues is critical.
Recently, the Universal Periodic Review took place.
It did.
Out in Geneva, Switzerland, I believe. And you had submitted some papers.
Right.
Tell us about what you said.
Right. So I was part of a grassroots community network and submitted a joint stakeholder report with another group where we emphasized the human rights abuses that women and girls were experiencing in immigration detention. And the stakeholder report was submitted in October of 2019, and obviously the Universal Periodic Review had to be postponed due to COVID. It was supposed to occur in May in Geneva and was postponed until November. But the issues that we raised were really critical, and for us, there were in the joint review, we certainly focused on the removal of children from the custody of their parents, and that has been a very common
theme of this administration.
Issue, right? Absolutely. But it's also been a very common theme in the things that outrage us, right, as a society. Like we really came together over the outrage of these children being removed from their families. But what we also emphasized is that the women and girls who were in immigration detention are not just mothers whose children have been taken from them, but other women and other menstruating and birthing folks who are still experiencing human rights abuses, including a lack of access to reproductive care, right, reproductive health care, a lack of access to menstrual materials, right? Menstrual hygiene materials. They're experiencing sexual violence. So all of these things were issues that we raised in this report to call attention to it for the international community and the Human Rights Council of the United Nations to take a look at the impacts of all of these things on migrant women in U.S. detention.
And these migrant women, they're being sexually abused by U.S. Border people. Who's doing the
Yeah.
abuse?
Well, so I think it's good to really share some details about all these experiences, right? I'm part of a community of women who really believes that women's experiences should be elevated. And I'm really glad that you asked that specific question because yes, in fact, there is one of the cases that we raised in our stakeholder report was the case of Sharkey v. ED, right? And ED is, of course, a non-descriptive person, right? Because it's like a Jane Doe moniker that's been given to this individual.
It's a
And
pseudonym.
correct. And she was a Guatemalan immigrant who had a 3-year-old son. And one of the people who worked in detention, I believe that he was a consultant that worked for ICE, right, for the customs enforcement, sexually abused her. He pled guilty, actually, to institutional abuse. And the United States refused to acknowledge that they had any obligation to keep her safe. Because she was, in their view, wasn't considered to be a prisoner because she was an immigrant. And we have domestic laws, right? Things like the Civil Rights Act for institutionalized persons. We have the Prison Rape Elimination Act, both of which apply a responsibility and obligation on the United States when they detain somebody, and immigration advocates agree that, right, detention is broad, not just prison, that they have an obligation to keep people safe. And there are certainly international mechanisms that, right, emphasize the importance of keeping women safe from gender-based violence. And so this particular issue we raised in our stakeholder report.
And how is all this viewed by the international community?
Well, so I think that it's important to understand that the U.S. Has often functioned within the context of human rights independently, right? So we are not a party to many international treaties. We have made the case whenever we are challenged on that, that our civil rights laws are far more protective than international human rights laws. But the international community remains concerned that these issues continue to occur with very little responsibility, very little intervention in the US. So for example, things like CEDAW, right, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, is a international treaty. We have not signed signed CEDAW. The international community consistently requests and recommends that we do sign on to CEDAW to protect women. But also there are mechanisms like the United Nations rules for the treatment of women prisoners, or what we would typically call the Bangkok rules, that set standards for the protection of women in detention. First of all, they emphasize, right, that detention should be used as a last resort, but also that when you do detain women in particular, you have to ensure that they're free from sexual abuse. And so the international community is actually really emphasizing the importance of these protections while the US in particular in over the last 4 years has sort of decried their lack of obligation or responsibility in these situations.
Okay. Now, the other issue that's in the forefront here is the
Mhm.
medical care of these
Right,
women and girls. Can you
right.
talk about that particular issue?
Yeah. So I think you're referencing some of the issues that I address, which is a lack of access to reproductive care, but also, we've heard a lot in the media recently about the forced sterilization
Yes.
of women, in particular in detention centers. So a recent case, right, is the case in Georgia, where the Southern Poverty Law Center actually just helped many of the women in that detention center file medical complaints with the medical board in the state of Georgia against the doctor that performed a variety of non-consensual sterilization techniques. So, hysterectomies when estrogen patches would have been sufficient, invasive surgeries and examinations when they were unnecessary. And so
This is
this,
reminiscent of forced sterilization in the
yeah,
Nazi regime,
it is. And
eugenics.
yes, exactly. And I think that this is really critical to understand. While certainly right now, um, uh, and because of my focus on migrant women, right, and certainly right now, this is something that we're hearing about. This is not new. Reproductive justice advocates have been talking about these issues for decades. In California, I'm in California. In California, we had a eugenics movement, right? And that eugenics movement was essentially saying that people who are poor or disabled, women, right, who are poor or disabled shouldn't be allowed to have children. We have a case, that was recently called to attention in the state of California in the women's prison, where women were having these same experiences, right? And this is not unusual. But what is really critical to understand is that it impacts the human rights, right, of women. The international human rights mechanisms say that women should be allowed to determine the size of their family when they have it, right? Which certainly means that abortion is a human right, but also means that they shouldn't be forced, right, simply because they are detained or incarcerated, to not have children, right, in the future. And so these are things that are coming to light right now, and certainly not new, but are definitely coming to light currently.
Do you know if some of these women that have undergone some of these non-consensual invasive procedures actually end up staying here, or are they sent back that way? Do you know what actually
Yeah.
happens to them?
Yeah. Well, it's difficult to really determine what happens. But there has been, and I don't have any direct, I haven't had any direct communication with many of these women, with some of these women, but there has been some reporting that they have been threatened with deportation if they came forward and disclosed these. And in some of these complaints that are being looked at right now and scrutinized, we're seeing that there have been threats. Now, the federal government has sort of stepped back and said, no, we're not going to deport any of these women if they come forward to report their experience. But many of them felt that this was a very real threat. So some of them certainly will end up being sent back to their home countries. Others may end up here, depending on their situations. But there have been real threats of deportation if they came forward. I think, I really like to emphasize something important when we talk about, in particular, migration detention, and especially the border between the United States and Mexico. Because while oftentimes we talk about it as an immigration issue. We forget that in fact, or maybe we don't want to talk about it, right? That in fact, it's a racial issue. So I'm the daughter of an immigrant. My mom was an immigrant. Her mom was an English woman who fell in love with an American soldier, right? And so my mom was not born here in the United States, but she didn't have this same experience, right? Because she is a white woman who was an acceptable migrant. And so I do think that you're right when we think about this as a migration story, right? That we have a banner that we place over the migration story that says, you know, give us your tired and your weary. But really, in some ways, we should add to that. Give us your tired and weary migrants as long as they fit into this particular category or that particular category. And so I think that you bring up a really important point, that while it is counter to much of what we like to talk about as the American migration story, or as the American dream, that there is this deeply embedded racism. I mean, the very first laws that prevented immigrants from having any status was the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1800s. It was specifically designed to prevent Chinese people from being able to enjoy the benefits of this country.
Right. There was different exclusions too. And even Irish Americans weren't welcome very well to the United States. They were frowned upon at one point in time. But I see that there is right now, especially with the Trump administration, there is this tendency to frown upon immigrants of color. He even pretty much said it when he says, where's everybody from Norway? Why aren't they coming here?
Well, we know the answer to that.
Yes, we do. They get better health care.
Right, exactly. And I mean, I think that we laugh about it, right? But you know, fundamentally, these are the things that we're talking about. You know, when the US takes responsibility for detaining someone, right? So these zero tolerance policies have increased the population of detained immigrants. So instead of what this administration is often called catch and release, which essentially means, by the way, is problematic because it equates, right, human beings with non-human beings, right, with fish and animals.
Right.
But the previous policy of what the Trump administration likes to call catch and release essentially created an opportunity for people to not be detained, right? To not fill detention centers. But when we detain somebody, when we prevent somebody from being able to access things like healthcare themselves, access menstrual materials themselves, when we prevent them from being able to go to a clinic because they're not free to move around, then we as a country take on responsibility for access to their healthcare obligations. And when we don't participate in that, then it becomes a human rights issue, right? Because we basically have said, you're not going to be able to do this on your own, but we're not going to do it either.
You know, a lot of people say, well, you know, why don't they just come here legally? You know, if they came here legally, this wouldn't be an issue. But I think what they're missing is that they're fleeing. You know, this is not something, you know, you plan out. You know, you're fleeing for your life. You don't have time to get papers in order. And they're coming to the border and saying, here I am. I need asylum. I've gone through this horrendous event coming forward. And, you know, that should be recognized by the U.S. government as asylum seekers. They're trying to come the right way. But a lot of people don't see that. Can you explain?
Well, so I do want to say something I think is really important, and you raised this issue just now, and that is that it is not illegal to be a refugee. It is not illegal to be a migrant. As a matter of fact, international human rights mechanisms develop specifically the right to be a migrant. You're not an illegal person simply because you are moving, right? And so I do think that that's an important issue to raise. What happens though is that because states, meaning countries, right? Because states have sovereignty, they can make their own decisions about who they let in and who they don't. This becomes sort of the barrier that allows us to use language of illegality, because it's not illegal actually to cross borders, to travel, right, around the world as a migrant. What happens is states, meaning governments, put in place certain rules that say you have to do it this way or that way. And so I think that it's incredibly important to acknowledge this language of legality or illegality, because the language of illegality, and I want to be clear that a human being is not illegal, right? A human being, a person is not illegal. Human beings are human beings. And so when we use these barriers to prevent people, for example, as you pointed out, from seeking safety, one of the push factors for most migrants is economic problems, right? They're oftentimes in societies or in countries where they have limited access to the ability to sustain their living in a basic way, housing, right, healthcare, have a job. And the reason there's this economic push factor is because of US economic development policies. And so when US companies, for example, move into countries to have less, to have to pay, their employees less, then it creates this sort of push out of people who need to find a better economic opportunity. Climate change, right? Climate change is a driving factor in migration, especially for women and girls. So so the US really has to acknowledge its responsibility in pushing some of these folks into migration. And so identifying somebody as being an illegal person, it creates all kinds of problems just in terms of humanity, right?
It's a
And empathy.
derogatory label.
Absolutely. And the legality changes, right? The legal structures at the border change depending on who's in an administration. So, the Trump administration had different legal requirements for migrants than the Obama administration did. That's not the fault of the people who are migrating.
Right. Now let's talk about some of those differences between the Obama administration and their policies and the Trump administration and the so-called kids in cages. Can you elaborate on that particular topic?
Yeah. So it's challenging, right? As a country, we have a challenging history with immigration. As I mentioned, the very first time that we legally created a structure to keep people out, it was the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? So it was intentionally designed legally to prevent certain people from having any kind of legal status. The Obama administration, there were often references in the immigration advocacy community to Obama being the deporter in chief, right? Meaning that he had a large number, perhaps the largest number of deportations, right, of past presidents. Sometimes that's based on the way that the immigration patterns occur. So if there's a large number of people that are immigrating, right, then deportations are obviously going to increase. But I do think that even though the Obama administration there were a lot of flaws in their immigration policy, there was there were in some ways a humanness around that, right? That versus the zero tolerance policies that look at every migrant entering the country as being out to do harm to someone. And so then you detain them, put them in a detention center, including children, women, girls, right,
And then
etc.
separating them from their parents and causing more trauma to people that
Hmm.
have already had
Hmm.
trauma.
Hmm. Right. And so, yeah, certainly there are definitely stark differences between the treatment of people in detention, but we don't want to sugarcoat our country's, policies around immigration. And it's particularly interesting considering that, um, you know, and Indigenous people are really talking about this and reminding us of this all the time, that unless you are a Native American in this country, you are an immigrant, or you
Exactly.
come from or a family of immigration. So, I think that those are really important points to highlight.
Mhm. So everybody's sort of got squatters' rights after they came.
But again, right, we go back to this idea of how race plays into it, right? Because we're not having conversations. I mean, I know this is sort of there's all kinds of reasons why this isn't true, but we're not having conversations about the treatment of people at the Canadian US border, right? We're not having those conversations. And the treatment of people at the Canadian US border is very different than the treatment of people at the Mexico US border. And so I think that we have to be really clear that not only are we talking about migration, not only are we talking about women, but we're also talking about the intersectional experiences of gender, immigration, and race.
Yes, we never hear these things at the Canadian border. Canadian
Mm-hmm.
border is it's not even a topic of discussion.
Right, right,
So I guess where do we go from here? We
right,
see that these women and girls have not only fled abuse or famine or whatever it is,
right,
they're being abused at the border. They're being sterilized against their will. The
right,
children have been separated from them and even go into foster care.
right,
I mean,
right. For-profit foster care.
yes.
Yeah,
And the for-profit detention,
right, right,
where is all this going? What do you
right,
see? Do you
right.
think the next administration will reverse some of these policies? What
Yeah,
do you think will happen?
yeah. Um, I think that's a really important question. And so when I think about where we go from here, the first thing that I always think about is recognition. For so many people over the last 4 years, the topic of immigration has become something important enough for them to care about, but so infrequently do they notice the experiences of women and girls and trans women, right, trans folks, gender non-binary folks in detention. And so I think recognition has to be key in this, like to really raise these issues and pay attention to them, to ask yourself what is really happening. And also I think because one of the things that you asked is what does this new administration do? I think that they also have to be willing to recognize the real issues that are happening, right? To be able to recognize that women, girls, trans folks, children, right, are all being impacted disproportionately by these problematic policies in detention. So I think recognition is really key to raise these issues. I think accountability is critical. One of the case that I was talking about earlier, the Sharkey case, the US essentially said, we don't have to take responsibility for her protection because she's not a prisoner, right? So we write laws that are intended to protect people, and then there's no accountability. And the special rapporteur on violence against women, when she came here in 2011, I believe, noted the problem of sexual abuse of women prisoners, not specifically in detention, but the sexual abuse of women prisoners by their detainers, right? So she was aware that this was an issue. So we need to have accountability. We need to, to say, look, as a country, we've done things wrong, and we need to account for that. Go ahead.
Do you think the United States is really saying that civil rights do not apply to these immigrants and those detained? Do you really think that is the real issue here?
Well, I can't imagine the US would formally ever say that civil rights don't apply. But I think that we can draw that
Conclusion.
we can draw that conclusion from their actions. And they in their country report, so during the UPR process, the Universal Periodic Review process, the country under review writes a report about their own human rights record. So you can imagine what that looks like for every country, not just the US, right? The country always says that they're doing a great job. But they specifically cited the civil rights protections that institutionalized persons have access to. There's an act specifically that protects them. At the same time, so they cited this as a reason that we are a human rights beacon in the world. And yet, we know that these are documented experiences that women in detention are having. So we can say it, but the actions, right, are really what's the most important thing to look at.
Yeah, the actions speak louder than words.
Correct.
Right. So, in conclusion, looking at the bigger picture here, we have, corporations in the United States that are making money in other countries that, have employed some of these people over the past who have avoided taxes in the United States. And for whatever reason, maybe those jobs have not, worked out. Maybe there's been factory closings or whatever. And of course, if they were in the agricultural industries, those folks would have, because of climate change, they would migrate north. So I think there's this idea in this country that these people are all coming to be freeloaders, to take from the system. And I don't believe that is the whole truth here. What have you seen? Have you seen any statistics on any of those particular issues?
Well, I think that what you're making is a really important point. And it goes back maybe to my point of accountability, right? We have to be accountable not only for our domestic practices, but also for our international practices. And, the idea of a freeloading system and that we all benefit from, quite frankly, right? Like we talked about earlier, I live in Southern California, and I have lots of great fruit that I can access that's imported, right? Because of policy, because of US economic policies. So I think that we have to acknowledge our own accountability in this international environment, in terms of not just the pushing, right? So the global destruction of, as you pointed out earlier, crops in other parts of the world that push people, but we tout an American dream, right? We say, come here, we're the best place for you to be. And so both of those things together can create, and quite frankly, even when we come and when migrants come, when we as people who live in the United States try to access things that we're told are great benefits like healthcare, a job, right? Freedom from a virus, we can't access it either. So we have, sort of these factors that are working together, right? This destruction of systems, people's lives in other parts of the world, and this promotion of this is the place that you come, but once you get here, right, it doesn't feel like you're being taken care of. And so we have to address both of these things at the same time.
Yeah, great marketing. I'm not so sure about the follow through.
Right.
Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close?
No, I'm really excited about this conversation because I think that so often when we think about women's rights, for example, we don't think about migrant women. We don't think about women in detention. When we think about migrants' rights or people in detention, we don't think about women. And so I think that this was a really important opportunity to highlight the intersectional, real lived experiences of women and girls expansively, meaning women and girls who identify as women and girls, right? Regardless of, your birth gender. So I really appreciate the conversation. I think it's been important to have.
Well, thank you for joining us. It's been enlightening. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
I want to thank our guest, Denice Labertew, for sharing her research and information on the treatment of migrant women and girls at the U.S. southern border. I also want to thank you, our viewers, for tuning in. For more information on today's topic and our guest, visit us online at thelegaledition.com. And remember, this information is for general educational purposes. It is not legal or professional advice. And now you can download our podcasts and subscribe online. Find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter.